From verbal and physical attacks to blaming and shaming, hate crimes and racist slurs directed at people of Asian descent have been on the rise in this country since the pandemic began. But it's just highlighted a long-standing problem that advocates say must now finally be confronted. With us for more in Edmonton, Alberta, Gina Wong, registered psychologist and a professor at Athabasca University in Alberta. And here in Ontario's capital city, Avvy Go, clinic director of the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic. Hello, welcome to you both.
Hi, Nam.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you both for being here. Before we start our discussion, I wanted to take a look at findings from a report that was compiled with data from incidents that were reported to the websites covidracism.ca and eliminate.org. Sheldon, could you please bring up the numbers for us? The report found that there have been 1,150 racist attacks across Canada against Asian people. 84% were against people of East Asian descent. 40% of these attacks took place here in Ontario. 73% were verbal harassment. 11% involved physical contact. 10% involved coughing or spitting, which of course is even worse now during the pandemic when we're facing a virus that spreads through droplets. The majority of these attacks occurred in public spaces outside, and in second place, the incidents took place most in food sector locations like grocery stores and restaurants. Avvy, you know, when you hear those numbers and you hear about some of these incidences that have happened to other people, what goes through your mind?
First of all, the report was compiled by our clinic along with the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice and CCNC Toronto, as well as Project 1907. And we have been collecting these data since last year. But I have to say that, you know, it doesn't surprise me because even before the pandemic was declared, you know, we have been calling on officials and government representatives to pay special attention to the possible rise of anti-Asian racism. As soon as the first case arrived in Canada, we already start to see incidents of hate and racism online, as well as Chinese restaurants and businesses being targeted. And that was back in January 2020. So, you know, nobody should be surprised by the incidents, but I think the number is still quite alarming, the fact that we have, you know, over 1,100 and 500 of those happened this year in 2021.
You know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I get a sense of frustration because this has been happening from the very beginning. Is that correct?
Yes, for sure. It has been happening since January, and even back in January 2020, there were over 10,000 parents who petitioned the York Region School Board, trying to convince the school board not to allow students who recently came back from China to attend school, even though at that time we only had like one case. And since then, of course, we know that most of the travel cases have nothing to do with China. Most of these cases come from US and Europe. But still, Chinese Canadians and other East Asian Canadians are still being targeted and blamed for the virus.
Dr. Wong?
I just wanted to add, what's interesting about the figures is that the US has reported 3,795 cases of reported hate and racism against Asian and Pacific Islanders. And when we look at the population, Canada has 17.7 Asian Canadians, while the US population has about 5.6. So Canada actually has 3 times the population of Asians. And so when we look at those statistics, it sounds like, you know, close to 4,000 is more than that. But when you look at the proportions, there is more inflated hate and racism against Canadians.
Are you surprised?
I don't know, shocked, surprised, not. It's a, you know, a complexity of feelings, and in some ways not, given, you know, what's happening and has happened with some of our elected officials. And in some ways, of course, that part of me that just can't believe this is happening is still quite shocked.
What about you, Avvy?
Well, I don't think anyone should be surprised. Canada has a very long history of anti-Asian racism. You know, for instance, 67 years of legislated racism against Chinese in the form of Chinese head tax and Exclusion Act. And other Asian communities have also been targeted by racist policies in Canada. And we also had the experience from 2003 during the SARS crisis. Once again, during that time, Chinese Canadian community was blamed for bringing SARS to Canada. I think what's happening this time is that partly because of social media, but also partly because of the declaration of the pandemic, the level and extent of hate and racism is far worse than what we saw in 2003.
This might sound like a silly question, but when we talk about hate crimes, I think when we talk about specific groups, like if we talk about the Jewish community or the Black community, we can identify what identifies as a hate crime. When it comes to the anti-Asian racism, how do you identify anti-Asian hate crimes? Dr. Wong?
Well, there's a spectrum involved. So from incivility, so acts of being shunned, racial slurs, the way that people look at us or jump back when they see us, those are all acts of racism. And to the other end of the continuum, which of course is the violence, the aggression, the attacks, the murders. So there's a wide range of what qualifies as racist acts.
Some people might say that being shunned isn't a hate crime. Avvy, how would you identify anti-Asian hate crimes?
So if we're talking about hate crimes in particular, then I would say that any act of physical violence, and that would include coughing and spitting, which is motivated by hate as a result of the perpetrator's view about a certain group of people because of their race, that would qualify as a hate crime. So if someone spit at me because I'm Chinese, I would define that as a hate crime or hate motivated crime. And the police can, in certain circumstances, they can investigate the case. If they arrest a perpetrator, and if that person is convicted, the hate motivation can form part of the sentencing factor.
Well, you mentioned the police. These numbers that we were talking about come from a community-created system to report incidents of racism. But the police do ask people to call and report incidents as well, and they keep reports of hate crimes. Why was there a need for a separate reporting system?
I think because most people would not even bother to call the police. Like, I myself, I actually had experienced some of these, sort of incidents, and I never called the police. Like, it happened to me on broad daylight when I'm walking on the street. The guy spat at me and walked away. I mean, even if I called the police, what could the police have done, right? So, but at the same time, these kind of incidents have a tremendous impact and long-lasting impact on people who experience it. And the reason why we created this website is to give voices to the victims who experience racism, and at the same time, really educate the Canadian public about the extent and nature of anti-Asian racism in Canada. Because I think all too often, Canadians do not think that there is anti-Asian racism, and they do not have any understanding of the historical racism towards Asian Canadians in Canada, notwithstanding all the years of legislative racism that I mentioned earlier.
Do you think that would make a difference if people understood the history of Asians in Canada?
It will make a difference in the sense that more people will become aware how serious the problem is. And if the public become more aware, then maybe the government will be more responsive. Because so far, I think that we're still waiting to see if the different levels of government will actually respond with concrete measures or support for community groups. And, we're just hoping with more public education, it would lead to more action.
Dr. Wong, I saw you. I want to come to you, but I just wanted to kind of touch on something that Avvy said about not maybe calling the police and not feeling like you can call the police. I think if anyone from the police is watching this, they might be upset by that because I think their role is supposed to be to help people. How do we work on that trust, Dr. Wong?
That really is the question. How do we do the work to make our systems, culturally responsive and safe? It's something that I think we as a society will continue to work on throughout many, many, decades and centuries. But when individuals have been hard-pressed and traumatized by systems, it's understandable that it's hard to go to the authorities. And I think, every police service is different, and what they offer, hopefully would be the support. But, it's up to each individual to know and to feel that trust. But until the dialogue is there, until we can talk about the, institutionalized and systemic oppression and racism, I think, of all BIPOC individuals, that's when, we can start looking at change and helping people to feel safe.
Because, this past year has been a year that's left a lot of people very stressed out. And to think that you would find yourself in a situation where you're experiencing a hate crime, and the people that are supposed to protect you, who you're supposed to count on, you don't feel like you can call them to, to have your back, so to speak. Avvy, do you find that maybe there are more people that this has happened to that maybe haven't reported it either on the websites that we mentioned or have gone to the police because of that?
I have no doubt that many people have never reported what happened to them, whether it's on our website or to the police. Certainly, almost every single Chinese Canadian I know over the last year has experienced some incident. But I think I also agree with Dr. Wong that every police services is different. For instance, in Ontario, we know that the York Regional Police seem to be more responsive and have been very proactive in supporting the East Asian communities in Markham area and have been making, a number of appropriate arrests. In contrast, the Toronto Police Services has not, been as responsive. There have been some cases that happened in Toronto where the police did not initially investigate as hate crime, and we don't know whether since then they have pursued any further investigation.
And Dr. Wong, after 9/11, we saw a lot of people targeting individual Muslims and blaming them for that incident. As soon as the pandemic started, as we've been talking about, we saw people harassing individual Asian people. What is the psychology behind racism surfacing during times of social crisis?
Racism is so attached to fear and feeling a lack of control. And, I think none of us are immune to that. And, in a way, it's trying to, exert that, this is outside of myself. There's someone to blame. And, I can sort of, stand aside outside of it. And so, trying to gain that control. And hate is something I think cultivated in the homes that we live in. And so looking at the ways that we raise our children and looking at our society and how our government supports the various ethnicities and the ways that inclusivity, diversity, and equity are focused and centered on.
And Avvy, I wanted to ask you about this because when the news broke of what happened in Atlanta last week and 6 Asian women were killed, there was a lot of disbelief. How does American violence impact Canadian Asian communities?
I think that, well, first of all, anti-Asian racism happens in North America. There are a lot of and historically, many of the policies that Canada introduced as it affects racialized groups are, they follow the example of the Americans. So the Americans started the Head Tax and Exclusion Act, and then we had our own version of Head Tax and Exclusion Act. But also, I think, as Dr. Wong mentioned about the levels of hate and racism in the state, no doubt that have also an impact on the psyche of Canadians as well. And I think the general level of fear, while I understand Dr. Wong talks about the act of racism is generated by fear, but we need to also remember that acts of racism also create fear among the victims. And right now, among the Asian Canadian community, many are really living in fear. Every time they step out of their home, they are afraid that they will be targeted again by some incident. Our sense of security our sense of dignity, and in some cases, our sense of the belonging is also under attack. So I think we need to focus on how fear and racism have affected the victims and the communities, not just Asian communities, but other racialized groups, and then design programs and actions and government support focusing on the victims.
Well, I think we mentioned social media a little bit at the beginning of the discussion, and we've seen politicians, most notably the former President Trump, blaming China for the coronavirus pandemic. How does that influence Canadians, Dr. Wong?
I think hearing racist tropes like the China virus and the Kung Flu virus from an elected official and leader like Trump makes a huge statement. When, I remember watching May of last year when he was talking to the reporter Jiang, who asked him a question about why he was focusing on the United States having the best testing facilities. And he told her, ask China. And then he framed her question and why he responded that way, that it was a nasty question. And then he shut down the press conference. And I watched that as an Asian woman, watching how Jiang was silenced, and then he, discontinued the whole press conference, was appalling. And it was silencing, and it was modeling, a stamp of approval, this normalization that you can ask China, blame China. And that type of rhetoric is so damaging and has had long-standing, and I think for even longer, consequences on Asian individuals.
There's been some people, Avvy, that have, I guess, defended the President Trump's use of that phrase. Why is that inaccurate? Because they say that the virus originated in China.
We don't know, and even assuming for a second that the virus originated in China, calling it Chinese virus or Wuhan virus have an impact on labeling and blaming the entire race. So the race of being like Chinese Canadians or Chinese Americans, blaming us, the individuals, for the virus. And also I think that the modeling of impact, it gives license to people who already harbor racist views about Chinese Canadians to go about doing the attacks that we've seen over the last year. And don't forget that we have our own version of blaming and shaming in Canada as well. One of our MPs, Derek Sloan, when he was running for the leadership race for the Conservative Party, he openly questioned the loyalty of Dr. Theresa Tam, calling her as, working for China as opposed to Canada. And, these are all very inappropriate, and I would argue racist comments as well.
Do you think that it helped that he was kicked out of the party? Was that a stand?
Well, he was kicked out not immediately, and I think for a number of days the party was silent as to whether or not they endorse or not endorse his view. And eventually he was not kicked out because of this statement, but because of other views that he expressed over time.
You see a lot of, on social media, there's a lot of conspiracy theories on YouTube. What roles do you think social media plays, Dr. Wong, in all this?
Social media basically is our conduit of information right now, as we're all at home with the pandemic. And so there's a huge influence, and, fake news and all of that, it's hard to tell. And, having some, stances that media takes in terms of what they deliver, I think, is really important. Our youth are so much on social media, as we are, as I am. And so it's a purveyor and, currently the way that we get our news and information. So it has a huge impact on the way that, Asian Canadians and Americans are depicted, and the ways, media and television entertainment have been stereotyping us, throughout time.
The vast majority of racist attacks are reported to be verbal harassment in public spaces, which I find so fascinating in the sense that before, racism kind of used to be whispered, but in these incidences, it's in public spaces. Is there any way to actually prevent that from happening, Avvy?
I think that's the $64 million question. How do we prevent racism? I think, it really requires a level of cooperation between levels of government, as well as between government and community organizations. Certainly, there are many organizations doing very good anti-racist work. I think the government should support what they're doing. We have to start thinking about how to educate our children and how to support children who are being bullied and subject to racist attacks. That the report that you cited today, we know that three particular groups are more likely to be victims: women, seniors, and children. So I think we should think about how to protect the vulnerable populations and people who are perceived as easy targets by the racists. But at the same time, I think in the long run, we just need stronger anti-racist legislation and anti-racism program, both at the federal and provincial level, so that we can prevent these things from happening to anyone.
Back when the SARS outbreak happened in 2003, Chinese restaurants began to lose a lot of business, and people were scared they would catch SARS. Again, kind of the same things we're seeing now. In response, then Prime Minister Jean Chrétien publicly had lunch at a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown to try to demonstrate that it was safe. Dr. Wong, do you think that that kind of strategy would work nowadays?
Absolutely. Any collective action to demonstrate that we are not, the virus, as people are, donning that description of us. And so when we see elected officials and individuals being inclusive and celebrating and, basic human, kindness to us, I think it hugely demonstrates to individuals and the public that, we are not different. We are not other. We belong here. And, when calls to action from the federal government and provincially, and they step in and they do these kinds of things to recognize what's happening for us, which is so essential, I think it makes a huge difference.
Most instances of anti-Asian crime have been verbal attacks in public spaces like we were talking about, and it can be difficult for people to speak up in those situations. Avvy, what should someone do if they do witness something like that happening?
So we have also started to think about doing more of these bystander kind of training. But of course, the first consideration is safety of the individuals. If it's safe for you to do so, then we are asking people to intervene. And intervening does not mean necessarily that you are standing between the person being attacked and the attacker, but rather it could take a form of distraction, calling for help, sort of calling out. So it depends on the circumstances that you find yourself in, witnessing something like this. As long as it's safe for you to do so, we do encourage people to speak out.
And Dr. Wong, what else can people do to help?
I think it's so essential, in addition to what Avvy said, which is so important, to step in and distract and do what you can. But also, it's so important to go up to the individual and say, I saw that, I see you, that was racist, that's not acceptable, are you okay? Because when we are seen and when someone says that, psychologically, we're co-regulated. We get that through someone else. And to be seen is so important now. Visibility is one of the issues that we face. The model minority, we're seen to be polite and to behave well. So attention hasn't been on our issues. And so when you see an individual, be sure to make it known that you saw it, and to stand with them. Otherwise, there's a sentiment that you're standing against them.
And you have a campaign called the Gold Ribbon Campaign. What is that?
Yes, I'm the proud ambassador of the Asian Gold Ribbon Campaign. And what that is a campaign to raise and continue sustained understanding about the psychological impact of the historical racism, as well as this current, swelling of anti-Asian hate and racism in North America and around the globe. We are in a state of emergency. This issue is very personal to me, and so, meaningful. My family has been affected. There's also that aspect of visibility with this campaign. And so, not staying quiet, as well, and additionally with the intersectionality also women and Canadians. We are polite. We are not supposed to ruffle feathers. And this campaign is about being seen and being heard and to make waves. So to wear yellow ribbons on May 13th, to demonstrate and to reclaim the color yellow. You know, we were called the yellow peril in the 19th century. And so, you know, taking that yellow gold color, celebrating it, wearing it to give us back that visibility. And lastly, I just want to say this campaign is going to involve youth. And, you know, we have tri-focus initiatives, a community outreach, celebration, visibility, and a fundraising component. We're just at the starting gate of this. And so we're welcoming partners and allies. And please visit our social media.
We will do that, Dr. Wong and Avvy Go. Thank you so much for taking time to talk about this really important situation. We really appreciate your insights and understand you're very busy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.